In this lesson, we will speak about sustainability from the political point of view. The notion of sustainability has entered political language in the early 1970s, in particular in the wake of the oil crisis of 1973. The very concept of development began to attract critical attention both in academic and in public discourse. Published in 1972, the year before the crisis, a report of the Club of Rome famously raised the question of the physical limits to growth, pointing to the disproportions between existing Earth's non-renewable resources and the economic and demographic rates of growth. 4 years later, a book by Fred Hirsch added to this analysis a theoretical investigation of the social limits to growth, critically focusing on the consumption pattern that had prevailed in the West in the 20th century. These interventions, combined with the first manifestations of ecological movements foreshadowed by Rachel Carson in a 1962 book, Silent Spring, opened the space in which, in the following decades, the search for a sustainable development, as well as such keywords as degrowth, became ubiquitous. There is a need to stress that the notion of development is itself a relatively recent notion. Critical works on the topic, which began to proliferate since the early 1990s, have demonstrated that it emerged in the wake of the Second World War. The reference to development has been key in debates regarding economic growth outside of the West, and it has worked hand in hand with the reference to underdevelopment. The notion has served as a battleground between opposite political views and the regime in the framework of the Cold War and decolonization. However, at least until the 1980s, development was widely understood in terms of industrial development, with an emphasis on the role of the state in its orchestration. Scholars such as Arturo Escobar and Kalyan Sanyal have critically analyzed the discourse and the materiality of development in Latin America and in India, shedding light on the huge amount of violence underlying and enabling them with respect both to exploitation of labor and to the spoiling of nature. These analyses have nurtured a critique of development that has taken various forms, including theories of post-development, and that inspire today ecological movements in many parts of the world, as well indigenous resistance against extractivism, mainly in Latin America. The critique of the notion of development thus radically transforms that of sustainability, which is increasingly forced to refer to the systematic conditions of reproduction of society. In this, it is more and more coupled with its opposite, namely the unsustainability of social inequalities, territorial differences, and climatic and environmental conditions. The more the situation is perceived as unsustainable by increasingly broader social movements, a distinction between climate justice and environmental justice emerges. This difference is based on the consideration that the response to climate change must involve the entire environment within which it takes place. The increase in carbon emissions and global warming depend, in fact, on the overall capitalist organization of society and cannot be solved by limited policies. Bruno Latour traced this situation back to the very way in which the relationship between nature and culture was imagined in modernity, asserting the need to invent new policies of nature in order to prevent science from being reduced to an instrument for the ever more intensive exploitation of nature itself. Environmental and climatic sustainability can be achieved by redefining the field of a political ecology that cannot limit itself to propose policies of adaptation to conditions that are now unsustainable, but which must confront with specific forms of agency in order to modify the contemporary social condition. The era characterized by the now indissoluble link between sustainability and unsustainability has been defined in various ways. The term Anthropocene indicates that the human, that is anthropos, and this activity is now the main cause of geological, climatic, and environmental changes on the planet on which we live. The term Capitalocene, on the other hand, identifies capitalism as the fundamental cause of those same changes. Although the processes indicated by the two terms are largely the same, as Jason W. Moore points out, the distinction is not purely academic. Politically, in fact, the two notions underlie different kinds of sustainability governance that may focus more on adaptation to climate change than on radically transform the conditions under which society reproduces itself. The contemporary problem of sustainability governance thus simultaneously poses a problem of organizing society and reconfiguring its political structures. Since it is not possible to think that the climate issues can be solved by or within single nation states, many scholars have put forward the hypothesis that the real governance of sustainability is only possible within a world or global state.